The third type of tissue, muscle, is specialized for contraction. It's what does all of the work in our body, moving the skeleton around, pumping blood through our body, moving food through the digestive tract, all of those things is done by muscle tissue. And there are a few different types of muscle tissue that we want to consider. The three types of muscle tissue are skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. Skeletal muscle is attached to the skeleton and moves our body, which is usually considered a voluntary action, although there are involuntary reflexes that involve skeletal muscles. And then cardiac muscle, which is the muscle found in the heart, specialized for the heart. No other organ has cardiac tissue in it, and the heart has only cardiac muscle in it as its muscle. And then finally there's smooth muscle, which is found in all other organs besides the heart. It's responsible for the simplest things, such as moving hair follicles in the skin, to controlling the pressure of blood in the blood vessels. At this point, we're going to just pay attention to how we classify muscle into its three basic types, what those types look like under the microscope, and their basic functions and major locations. This table from the book lays that information out fairly clearly. This is skeletal muscle tissue. There are two main features that we recognize when we look at it under the microscope. The first of those is that it's striated. It has alternating bands of dark and light staining, which has to do with the molecular structure within the cells. The other thing that we notice is the multiple nuclei per cell. Now, in this field of view, we see parts of probably about 9 different muscle fibers or muscle cells, but we see upwards of 50 nuclei. So obviously there's more than one nucleus per cell. And the reason for that is that the cells that develop into the mature muscle cells are all mononucleated, and they fuse together to make one long fiber, the whole length of the muscle, say from the shoulder just past the elbow for the biceps brachii. And those individual nuclei that now are throughout that whole cell are responsible for controlling the functions in that particular area of the muscle that nuclei are for, which is directing protein synthesis and an oversight of metabolic processes. This is cardiac muscle tissue. Now this micrograph is a little bit fuzzy in the focus, but it shows the main features that we want to see. There is also striations in cardiac muscle fiber, but they're a little bit more subtle. They can be seen in this micrograph in the top right corner, in the third fiber in, especially in the part where it's a little faded. You can see the darker striations in between the lighter faded out part. But the problem with striations in cardiac muscle tissue under the microscope is that they are fairly faint, and when you stain the tissue well to see the fibers, the striations aren't always so obvious. It's better to see them where there's a little fading or overstaining of tissue. And we can see a little of that here. Now, cardiac muscle tissue is also mononucleated. And if you look at the number of fibers passing through this field of view and count the number of nuclei, it's fairly close to a 1-to-1 ratio. Now, in skeletal muscle fibers, those fibers are the entire length of the muscle. In cardiac muscle, the fibers, the cells, are actually smaller. They're interconnected with each other through structures called intercalated discs. There's not a lot of intercalated discs in this field of view. Again, over on the right side, sort of that same fiber that you can see the striations in, right by the edge of the field of view, there's a dark band. Might be confused for a nucleus, but if you look at it closely, you can see that it is one stripe right across with a little bit of black staining to the top of that region. That's an intercalated disc, and that's actually the boundary between two cells. We don't see a lot of those here. Again, the staining has to be perfect. There's a few hints of what might be here, but it's hard to say for certain. So the fibers that are going across this field of view aren't necessarily single cells. It might be two cells that we're seeing parts of, and so we'd see possibly two nuclei in the fiber seemingly next to each other. One thing that students often get confused about with cardiac muscle tissue is that it's unique for the heart. If I ask the question of what type of tissue, muscle tissue, is found in the heart, I will get students saying smooth muscle. I can only imagine that they think going, well, smooth muscle is found in organs and the heart is an organ, therefore it must be that. But keep in mind, cardiac muscle tissue is specialized for the heart, and the heart has to do a different type of contraction than pretty much every other organ in your body. So it has its own dedicated type of muscle tissue. Finally, we have smooth muscle. Now, as a micrograph, smooth muscle is not going to have a whole lot of detail to it. It's not striated like skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle. And so it stains fairly monochromatic, and the fibers really kind of blend into each other. They're actually fairly small, if you can kind of imagine the thickness of one of these nuclei as being the width of your average smooth muscle fiber. You could imagine that across this field of view in a vertical direction, there's probably 30 or more fibers passing through, as opposed to the dozen or less fibers that we saw in the other two micrographs, assuming that the magnification factors are equal between the three. But it looks very different. It's not striated. It works on a different principle, how it contracts, than the other two. We'll talk about those principles when we get to the muscle chapter later in the course, but at this point we just want to recognize the differences between the types of muscle. Skeletal and cardiac are both striated. Skeletal is multinucleated, and cardiac and smooth are both mononucleated. From those two characteristics, you can kind of pick out which of the three types of muscle tissue there must be in a micrograph. Consider this question. When you feel that you've reached an answer, hit the next button to go into the next slide, which will reveal the correct answer. Again, skeletal muscle is the one that has multiple nuclei because individual cells during development merge together to make one long cell that goes the length of the muscle. Choice A here, involuntary, I added in to give it 4 choices, but also because involuntary is usually used to talk about cardiac and smooth muscle, as opposed to voluntary, which refers to skeletal muscle. We have no voluntary control over cardiac or smooth muscle, and that's where the name comes from. We do have voluntary control over skeletal muscle. We don't always have to be voluntarily controlling skeletal muscle. You breathe because of skeletal muscles, but you don't have to think about doing it. It happens automatically, reflexively. But still, you can control skeletal muscle, like the ones for breathing. When you speak, you're controlling them to produce speech sounds.